So I don't know if you've ever heard of people such as Amy Winehouse. You've probably heard of St. John Bosco. St. John Bosco and Amy Winehouse had very similar upbringings in the sense that you could say they were orphaned. And St. John Bosco became a saint. But Amy Winehouse, maybe not our age group, but she was an alcoholic and she died of an overdose. At age 27, her last words in a cell phone message were, "I don't want to die." That's what she said, but then sadly she did die. And it's interesting, John Bosco, also orphaned, you could say he had the harder childhood of the two. His father died when I believe he was 2 years old, and then his mother had lots of kids and had to work really hard. And so he wasn't, I guess, a complete orphan in that sense. But he had much trial in his childhood, St. John Bosco. But he was able, through the power of God's grace, to be transformed. And he was able to experience such an overwhelming help from God's unconditional love that he shared that love with many orphans, many others who were in need. It says in the book of James that to care for widows and orphans in their distress is right religion before God, and in reality, that's right religion. And we don't deny that. I don't think any of us would disagree that it's good to care for widows and orphans. They did that in the early church. They do that today. But I would posit to you that there are future St. John Boscos in our midst, that there are many Amy Winehouse characters who are feeling a loss, struggling through it, and not finding God's love. And maybe turning to whether it's a bottle or a screen or who knows what else. So this is a great opportunity for us to really open our eyes. And I want to begin with something that's just sort of obvious, a statement that you probably would agree with, which is God is love. God is love. But what is the quality of that love? And maybe more importantly, how can we feel it? Some people don't feel God's love. They just don't experience it for whatever reason. And maybe that's us, or at times it was us. I would say on this point that we need to start with Jesus himself. Jesus is the visible sign of God the Father. And Jesus offers us a vision of how God's love is. As Jesus cares for the sick, that's how God the Father cares for those in need. As Jesus heals, so God wants to heal. It's really incredible the healing that Jesus can give. So I want to pass something out to visualize this. Maybe one group can take this section here. Yeah, Linda, thank you. Wow, this is funny looking. I thought the whole pack was Sacred Heart. Let's just go with half. And then you can pass this out to the other half. We'll go as far as we can. Unfortunately, after about 50 cards in, it turns into various random prayer cards that I did not realize. Wow, every single one is different once you get past the first 50. But that's okay. If you have a Sacred Heart image, great. If not, you could try to angle your eyes into there or just think about Jesus' Sacred Heart. We'll pass those out in just a moment. And so this will focus us. If I've given you a sheet, you're probably wondering, why is he so far off the sheet? We'll get back there. But as she passes them out, I want you to, with your eyes, look down at Jesus' face and his heart in that particular prayer card. And I want you to really, really gaze at Jesus and his heart just for a few moments of silence. Maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't. In the time of St. Margaret Mary, when this idea, this image, you might say, of Jesus' Sacred Heart came into the church in Mass, it was there in elements with other saints, but with St. Margaret Mary in France, it really took on a great, it was like wildfire. Like if the big thing of, you name it, Curcio, guitars at Mass, those types of things took over a lot of the church. in the time of the Sacred Heart, it was this image. Everyone loved this image. The church had gotten into Jansenism and had gotten into this idea that you somehow have to earn God's love. You somehow are not worthy of God's love until you are perfect. And this idea was really dangerous. And so the idea of St. Margaret Mary, through her revelation, you might say the articulation of her revelation, is that Jesus is love. Jesus is so much in love with us that his Sacred Heart is burning. That's why there's flames coming up out of the heart. It's burning with zeal for sinners. That really cut right to the heart of the Jansenistic heresy, that he loves sinners even if they sin. Not that he would want them to keep it. They would go to hell if they persisted in grave sin. But he still loves them, and he calls them to himself. This idea of the charity of Christ who goes to us in our need. Notice, though, that there's a crown of thorns around the heart. And that is very interesting, because in the scriptures, the crown of thorns is on Jesus' head. But here in the image, it's on his heart. Part of it is that he's glorified and he doesn't really bleed anymore now that he's resurrected and ascended. But another part of it is that it's an image for us. Our hearts are wounded. Original sin, personal sin, any trauma we've experienced. The news can make our hearts burdened. And even just sort of I've mentioned this, I think, on Sunday, an idea of acedia, just sort of the certain malaise of modern life. All of those things poke our hearts like those crowns are poking Jesus' heart there. But I posit to you that could be a blessing in disguise, that if we had totally healed hearts, totally perfect lives, maybe the light of God's love couldn't come in as deep as he wants to come in, and it's through those poke points that we get, you might say, the path to healing. So I would say the topic of the whole hour here is God's unconditional love would lead to healing, our personal healing and the healing of the whole world. And our main theme is going to be that without the love of God as an unconditional presence, that maybe you've seen this. Maybe you've seen people trying to earn love from others. It's rampant in society, and it's actually at the root of a lot of addictions, because when people realize that they can't earn the love that they so yearn by doing a really good job at their work, or by being a great sports athlete, or even just sort of the whole relational quest where you think another person could complete you, but then they don't, and you're crestfallen. There's more we could say about all those imperfect or conditional aspects of love. For instance, in a romantic relationship, there's often a flourish of emotion, and you think, well, this is perfect. It's always going to be perfect. But then when the rubber hits the road and maybe the mask comes off, or you see the person who they really are and not just who you thought they were, there's this element of, okay, this person doesn't make me feel the way they used to make me feel. Will I then choose to love them without condition, so that when they are really ugly or distasteful, I still love them, even if it doesn't feel like it? And that's exactly how God relates to us. That, you little babies baptized beautifully and all this, it's like that's the first rush of love, the falling. God loved us before. It's just, He hadn't given us sanctifying grace. We don't have time to go into all of these details for this topic. But your kids, if you've had biological children, or if you've adopted, or if you've been an aunt or an uncle or a godparent or whatnot, you see that the beautiful, maybe picturesque moments of human life are coupled with many other moments that we probably would not want to take pictures of or videos of or remember. Maybe they're so traumatic we block them out of our minds. These very difficult moments sometimes. And the gift of it all is that Jesus Christ in his Sacred Heart, he looks with love upon all of it. All of the messiness, all of that hurt, he can heal. He doesn't run away. He doesn't divorce us, you might say. I will say in honesty, we divorce ourselves from him. That's what a mortal sin is, something that we know is gravely wrong. We fully know that it's wrong, and we choose to do it anyways, or to not do something that we should do, which is good, like coming to Mass on Sunday. Those three things together is kind of like our attempt maybe to punch God out of our life, and really it's just sort of us drawing back or divorcing God, so to speak. It's very dramatic what happens there in the soul. And that is great trouble. Because if someone then lives apart from God or divorced from God, they've got this wound, the God wound, that to some degree we all have, but it's very raw with someone in the state of grave sin, mortal sin. But let's get practical here. Let's read from the scripture. And I want to read this passage of Matthew's Gospel. This is Matthew 9, verses 35 to 36. It says that then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, his heart was moved with compassion for them, because they were troubled and abandoned, like sheep without a shepherd. I'll summarize that if it's hard to grasp audibly. Jesus is teaching, he looks out, and he is filled with compassion in his heart for those who are troubled and abandoned and who are like sheep without a shepherd. Perhaps if you join us later, you'll see this in text form, but the word compassion there is from this idea of a Greek word that the guts of Jesus, from the very depths of his being, he sees wounded people and he is willing to sort of pierce his own heart for them in the moment. He is filled with compassion for them. And that is a great image for us. When God loves us, whether we experience it or not, we are loved perfectly. We are loved in a way that can make us whole. We are loved in a way that can heal us. The problem is there's often tons of barriers to that. God is constantly, like the rays of the sun, trying to bask us in his glory and his loving rays. But sometimes we put up a block. Maybe we've got sunscreen on. You could say a life of secularism is just, it's like you're slick. You're just covered in the culture, and you're not able to receive the sanctifying grace of God. Another thing would be like a big umbrella. That would be like an image of mortal sin. It's just completely blocking the rays of the sun. And yet, God can kind of work his way. He can kind of woo us. I've said this before. He kind of woos us even in grave sin. Somehow historically speaking, saints have done grave sin and then became saints. So there's some movement there. And it's not just the movement of sorrow and sadness. It's his movement towards us. That he will never stop loving us. And so I'm very fair-skinned. I once got sunburn under an umbrella in the summer. That's how sensitive I am to the sun. And maybe that can be an image for us of God's love it's still going to somehow try to reach us. And it does, because if you've ever been in this troublesome state of mortal sin, you feel the guilt or you feel the pull. Or Jesus says, I knock at the door. If anyone would listen, just open and I will come and I will dine with him. Like Jesus is very bold. It's this image of the prodigal son, perhaps, where we've done so bad, but he just wants to adorn us with crowns and great food and dancing and music and all this. So this is powerful. And then that's sort of theological, right? And it doesn't make much of an impact if it's only theological. But what if it becomes visceral and human? And what if it becomes a personal encounter? And this is where I'm going to read from another just part of Holy Scripture. I think you know, for context, that St. Paul was once known as Saul, and that he was very, very against Christianity. He didn't like the gospel. He wanted to kill or persecute people who were Christian. But he has a conversion, and we won't go into that, but the effects of his conversion are listed in the book of Philippians. It's a letter in the New Testament. And in Philippians chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, St. Paul says this. He says that God is my witness how I long for all of you in the church of Philippi with the affection of Christ Jesus. And this is my prayer, that your love, agape love, may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. That's a lot of words if you're just hearing this audibly. So I'll summarize it, that Paul in Philippians who once hated the church of Jesus Christ, now says to a particular church of Jesus Christ that he loves them with the same affection that is in the heart of Jesus Christ, and that he wants them to be holy and pure for heaven. And it's interesting that I read the passage from Matthew about Jesus' guts being filled with pity for the people. The same word in Greek is used here for the affection that Paul has in his heart for the church. A church that is filled with imperfect and messy people, but people striving to be whole and healed. And he says that affection is the affection of Christ Jesus. This is where things can become real, and you might say visceral, or you might say in the flesh. So Paul would have hugged these people. He would have spent time, meals, maybe fish fry dinners with these people. He would have been their pastor or their shepherd. And so then when he's traveled all around the world and he can think in prayer and recollection, think about those people. His heart can remember real experiences, real conversations, and maybe the power of God at work in those real lives. And that is, I would say, the essence of who we are as a church. Now, you could say that the source and summit of our church is the Holy Eucharist. And that's absolutely correct. But sometimes Catholics, and I was one of them, can come in the presence of the Holy of Holies and maybe even receive the Holy Eucharist in their hearts, their souls, and their bodies, and go back to the pew, and then go back to their life, and they could have nothing of the affection of Christ Jesus, his affection for them, or an encounter of them sharing that charity with others. What's the block if that's the experience of someone that I used to have? What is going on? That God could come so close to us, but we would just be totally aloof, as if this was bread. Or worse, as if this was less than bread. Because sometimes when we eat bread, we at least feel satisfied on an earthly level. There's something about an unholy reception of Holy Communion, or an inattentive reception of Holy Communion, that is almost it's a farce. It's not even satisfying an earthly hunger. It's just empty. And that's not to say that God couldn't work through that. Unknowingly, I did that for week after week, and God somehow used the foundation of my faith, weak as it was, to lead me to deeper faith, to confession, to other good things, to things that made this faith real. And particularly to people, certain priests, certain parishioners. I was not a priest at the time when I came back to the faith. Certain people who, I use this a lot, I think we can get it, it's a great image, who were the face of Jesus for me. And by spending time with them, looking at their real face, my face began to change too. In those conversations, in those moments, in those encounters, they had encountered the unconditional love of God. And I was getting it reflected from their faces. Remember the image of the sun. Jesus is trying to give us a sun, S-O-N, tan. And when you see someone who's tanned, hopefully they're not getting skin cancer, but you can see the effects, as Moses saw in the tent of the Holy of Holies. He would come before the presence of God, before the Holy Eucharist even existed, before Jesus was in the flesh. There was a change in prayer that made Moses' face radiant. And they didn't even want to look at it in the Old Testament. Who knows? Maybe they felt convicted and guilty. Maybe it was just too brilliant for them to behold. But Moses had this encounter. His face was changed. And that is the life of a baptized Christian, is to be the face of Jesus in our world. And without that, I'm not trying to make a political statement, but you couldn't see half of people's faces for a very long time. And then you were staying home for a very long time, and maybe watching a lot of things on the media that made you very anxious or fearful, maybe made you want to stay more isolated and more disconnected from other people who could have been presences of the grace of Christ to you, but were for whatever reason estranged because of circumstance. And we didn't even have Mass for, 7, 8, 9 weeks, however many weeks that was. That was very challenging for all of us. But more challenging still is someone who never had faith. And maybe I can go into now. I wanted to give more examples of Amy Winehouse and St. John Bosco. But I think a better image is this quote. Here's a quote. Okay, context for this quote, and then you'll see where I'm going with Amy and St. John. There was a series. Now, HBO is a really notorious channel for gratuitous bad stuff. But once I was on an airplane, and I just saw this thing come up. I didn't know it was from HBO. But the series you could watch on the airplane was called The Young Pope. I don't know if you've ever heard of this. It was 5 or 6 years ago. It was really popular. And in this show, The Young Pope, there is someone like myself or Father Peter's age who was a bishop, and then maybe like 10 years later became Pope. So an extreme, like younger than John Paul II, an extremely young Pope. And without going into all the details, the key facet of this Pope's history is that he was raised in an orphanage. Remember, care for widows and orphans is right religion before God. Well, this Pope had the experience of being an orphan. And in the Vatican, he's talking to a cardinal, and the cardinal says to the Pope, who's very young and was an orphan, the cardinal says, "You surprise me, Holy Father. You are young, and yet you have such old ideas." And the Pope says, "What's wrong about that?" Or, excuse me, I'm misspeaking. "You're wrong about that, Cardinal. I am an orphan, and orphans are never young." And then the Cardinal says, "But the majority of churchgoers are not orphans." And the Pope says this. Says who? You really think the only orphans are those without a mother and father? I don't know if you grasp that, but the Pope is saying that the term orphan or widow is more than someone who's lost a parent or a spouse. That even in a holy marriage, say the sacrament of marriage, but maybe it doesn't feel very holy at times, even in a home, like we could think of Spencerport, and we could think of an abstract idea of a home, and maybe the lights are on. But how much of God's light, God's love is in those relationships? If maybe parents are super busy and stressed, no judgment, let's just look honestly, life is stressful. If maybe they don't even have meals together in that home. If maybe the kids turn to the screen as sort of a pacifier, and this was a headline I read the other day, that the effects of whether it's smoking or a baby with a pacifier, just kind of a coping kind of stress relief, that many adults would say that that's what their cell phone is. They are anxious, so they don't know what to do, so they turn to it. And it pacifies their feelings of, frankly, being an orphan. In that moment, they're looking for consolation, they're looking for help. God seems distant, or the people of God do not seem visibly present in comforting them, so they go for something that comforts them. This is the cycle of addiction that Amy Winehouse fell into. She felt bad, so she turned to do something to make her feel better. For her, it was alcohol, other things too. We won't go into her other struggles. But she just wanted to feel less alone. She just wanted to feel better. I went to New York City 2 weeks ago, in part for an exhibit that was on Amy Winehouse in a Catholic cultural event that I'll talk about in detail some other time. And they had great descriptions of her life. They showed pictures of Amy when she was still innocent and young. They showed the beauty on her face. She was a beautiful woman, even in her addiction. But they showed the innocence of her face back then. She was Jewish. She never conceivably knew Jesus Christ. Who knows what happened at the moments just as she was dying. God can sometimes come miraculously. But she had a couple things happen. Her parents, at age 10, divorced. There was an ongoing affair that her father was having. And what happened is she lived with her mother after this. The dad would only come in on the weekend, sort of a father wound, you could say. But then with the mother, there was just maybe in her trauma, there was this neglect. So little teenage Amy goes and does whatever she wants because doesn't feel maybe that mom cares at home. And she gets more and more embroiled into sort of the music scene of London. And that, could you imagine, be filled with many snares and temptations for a young woman. And she somehow makes it popular. She becomes a hit. This is around age 2007, that she gets her first record deal. And let's look at that. Her music, if you've ever heard it, it sounds like something from the Beehive 60s. It's like, it's really a revival of jazz, of the I'm not of an older generation, so I can't think of it. It's not Motown. It's earlier than that. I just call it the Beehive Jazz African-American scene. And this Jewish woman from London sounds just like them. And she even puts her hair in a beehive, if you've ever seen Amy Winehouse. That's her hairdo. And so she is known as like this best jazz singer in the world. And what would happen in her concerts and in her personal life is she reached this great success, but she was often drunk during the concert. She was often so bored with her success in her life that she just needed to cope. One bright spot in her life was her marriage, which sadly died. Sometimes this happens. I said before, you fall in love, but then you see who the other person is. She, because of her own trauma, was sort of subconsciously attracted to someone who was also addicted, which is often the case. We sort of subliminally like people who are like us, or, interestingly enough, like our parents. And we're either trying to fix that through our spouse, or we're trying to somehow prove that, it wasn't that bad. I can, whatever. We don't want to get too psychological about generational stuff. But Amy has a codependent, that's a term meaning she needed her husband needed her. They were like it was not it was a love, let's say, but it was not a healthy love. It was sort of a burning love, not in a holy way. It was like they were enabling each other in their addictions. It was bad. And they needed each other, so much so that after the divorce, Amy is in her dressing room before a concert one day, and she's just crying, disconsolate. This is sort of, sometimes people feel great abandonment, and they're just uncontrollably crying because something happens, and they just can't get past it. So her words were, I can't go on. I need my husband. How can I go on without him? And it didn't work, but she still wanted him. They civilly divorced. That was the agreement because it was too painful, and then it brought other pains. And I won't go on too long, but I will say this, that she was able to channel her difficulties not only into drinking or to try to get some coping from that, but she would write her own songs. That's pretty rare in the 2000s, in the 2010 era. She died, I believe it was 2011 or 2013, and she was still writing her own songs, and she would use this sort of creative energy as an outlet for her great hurt. And that's as far as it went, because sadly, creativity was not enough. She was swept up by her addiction, and things did not go so well. In fact, her good friend, a man, Russell Brand, I believe his name is, don't quote me on that, but he was a British actor of the same era. He was really popular in that era. He's not as popular now, but he was able to triumph through his alcohol addiction. And he was able to say things like this about Amy. I'm just paraphrasing a quote that I saw at the exhibition there in New York. He said, you always hope there's going to be some cry for help, a phone call. And you hope that it's from the person in need. Amy didn't call her friend Russell. Instead, Russell got the call from the police that it was too late, that Amy had died. And so he said, if it gets really bad, you're going to get one or the other call. And how can we then as a church foster a welcoming, it's a connection with people in the world, maybe even people in our own families, extended family, our own particular family. How can we make them feel that they're comfortable enough to call us if they're struggling with whatever? We're all addicted to sin. It's just what form has that sin taken? For Amy, it was, among other things, drinking. For John Bosco, maybe it was pride. Maybe that was his major sin. But before I get into John Bosco, let's not forget that we want there to be enough of a connection that when it gets really bad, that the call is from the person in need to us. And as a parenthesis, before I go into John Bosco, none of us are probably trained crisis relief responders. None of us are addiction counselors. We're not perfect, but we may be just the person who is simply an ear, simply a presence, not someone who is going to try to heal that person ourselves, not someone who's going to be weighed down by their troubles, but just someone to listen. That's all that God is really asking for us. I don't want to get too off topic. So what happened with John Bosco is he was a really great kid, really creative. Like Amy was creative in music, he was creative in things such as athletics, and he was in like juggling, and he would do all these acrobatic stuff. He would do really marvelous things. But somehow, the pride of just wanting his life to go his way John Bosco was able to surrender that to God. And he was able to say, God, what do you want? Do you want me to be a monk, a priest, a married person, a single person in the world, a diocesan priest? He really struggled, John Bosco, with this question, should I be a religious priest or should I be a diocesan priest? And he eventually, if I'm not mistaken, I believe he went the route of a diocesan priest initially. But that's kind of irrelevant, because what he did is he said to God, I have gifts, just as Amy did, but I'm going to give them to you, God. I'm going to give you, and the number one gift we have is time. The time that we have is such an incredible gift that if we could give that to God, instead of maybe throwing it away in unnecessary media is fine, but if it's way too much, how many people, I'll give you an example. I went to give ashes in a nursing home on Wednesday, and some people who are really Catholic were wall-to-wall watching the Ukraine, live stream, let's call it, bomb after bomb of what's happening in Ukraine. And I find that really sad, that even if their justification is, well, I'm praying for this, this is how I can help. That's really violent content to be receiving for hours a day. But I would say a lot of the secular media, whether it's physical violence or emotional violence or moral violence, a lot of the media is as bombastic in a bad way as some of the stuff that's happening in Ukraine. And we do pray for anyone there. We pray for soldiers on both sides, for those who are separated from families, for those who will become orphans if they have not already become because of that conflict. But God is permitting that for some greater good. And maybe, so the idea, and I don't want to get too far afield, is the idea is time. Time it took for Amy to write her songs. But what John Bosco did is he invested some of his time not only in creative pursuits, but in prayer, and in time with Jesus, and in time with the people of Jesus. And his face, as I said, became changed so that these little kids saw him as a loving father. He was able to bless them with his presence. And he didn't sort of own them. He didn't take possession of them. That would be maybe trying to fill his needs with his ministry. But what he did was he simply gave them a reflection of God's love by spending time that, I said, use that same image, the sunlight radiantly hitting those kids and other saints. It's a whole pack of saints. Hundreds and hundreds of kids are blessed. Some of them, like St. Dominic Savio, are canonized saints from this direct encounter with John Bosco. So there you see this image of James, the book of James, that right religion before God is care for widows and orphans in their distress. And that was the life of St. John Bosco. He bestowed God's love to them. But I don't think I've officially ever given you some examples of, in the flesh, God's unconditional love and how healing that can be. So that's where we're going to kind of go now. So sometimes in a family, because they're busy, because we're in this culture, and that inevitably yields difficulties. I don't want to get too abstract, but let's think of this. All the way back to Adam and Eve, you have imperfect families. The only difference is the family of Jesus, the Holy Family. But from generation after generation, there's troubles, there's strife, addiction, whatever. Even if it's just the addiction to pride and to sin, there's something in our family tree. And our response to that is often to guard our hearts. And maybe the most surreptitious or the most deceiving way that the devil wants to guard our hearts is when our love becomes conditional. It happens to all of us. It's inevitable. But here's how it looks. That I mentioned before, the little baby who is so beautiful at baptism and in those precious moments begins to do things that make us frustrated, and they're constantly waking us up at night. And what was once a treasure to, maybe from a mother's sake, I'm told, I've asked for some examples, the 2-hour feedings every night, maybe the joy of that bonding becomes a terror when you just can't sleep anymore, and so there's this sense that I feel love for this person when things are good and positive. And when things are negative and hurtful or stressful, I begin to not feel love to this person. That's the root of conditional love, that we're conditioning our love to them based on how it feels. Is it going to be flowers all the time? No, life never is. And roses and all this. Interestingly enough, the beauty of biology, or botany, I guess is the term, is that all those thorns on a rose lead to the great flower. That's actually how human love is. Although in the end, it may be beautiful and purified with God's help, every step along the way is going to be one thorn after another. But this is not to make ourselves victims or, not free persons or constantly being victimized, wounded, all that. Not at all. There is a need if you're being abused. There is a need if you are in whether it's an emotional or physical abuse, there is a need for boundaries. And maybe we love people from a really long distance, but we still love them. Or we still let that grudge go, or whatever. But here's the beauty of it. The beauty of it is that by letting those little thorns poke us, remember the crown of thorns. We don't know what type of brambles they used, but they used a physical plant that was pokey, and they strung it together, and they put it on his head, and now it is on his heart. So that's the connection. When you, or any of us watching at home, when you are hurting, and maybe it's not your fault, and maybe someone has done wrong, remember that Jesus' heart is pierced in that same moment. That wound, that experience is a doorway. It's a doorway to something incredible. And the end result would be healing and holiness. But in the meantime, we have to go to hell. Hell is the first step from that wound. What I mean, I'm kind of being a little hyperbolic or tongue-in-cheek here. What I mean is we have to deal with our stuff, our messiness, our own wounds, our own hurt, and our own baggage of conditioned love. Let's imagine a person like Amy Winehouse who felt that she had to prove that she was worthy of love by making it big on the music charts. And so she sacrifices so much time and so much energy to just kind of put herself out there, thinking that only when I make success will I be worthy of the love that maybe, for whatever reason, her parents never really showed to her. Maybe in the teenage years, her music was somehow a way to attract them to her concerts or to whatever. And so she got into that habit. But that's not human love, or that's not godly love. That's a type of conditioned love. That's really a rat race. And we think of rat race in the careerism mindset or the secular mindset. But it could be anything. So many of our kids, I was told, during coronavirus, they would sit on the bus and they would have masks on, and they wouldn't talk to anybody on the bus. And they would watch their phones the whole time of the bus, and the whole time after school on the bus. And if you didn't know this, it's pretty sad. The experience of school lunches during coronavirus was the same thing, except the food was going in, and the mask was temporarily off. A lot of those kids just looked at their screens the whole time, and didn't talk to the socially distanced room around them. And so in that world, we should know this, because maybe those orphans are people that we can spiritually pray for or spiritually adopt in a healthy and a non-possessive way. Those orphans are somehow trying to get consolation from the screen, and maybe if they really get into it, they're going to become the performers on that screen. And to get really attractive and lots of likes, you often have to do very violent or very sexually provocative things. That's just our appetites are so maybe wounded or in need, whatever, that's where these kids feel the pull. I don't know if you've seen so many TikTokers. TikTok is an app. The predominant social media, the number one thing that people are watching on the internet is TikTok. It's really sad. But it's filled with a lot of people, and I hate to say, a lot of them are young teenage girls who are trying to show how beautiful they are, and maybe it's just their face. But there's this pull. They have to lose weight. They have to always be attractive. And so many of them have committed suicide because it's just this rat race. It's this constant conditioned love. My love, they may feel, is based on how many likes and follows this video is getting. And I have to do more and more provocative things to keep feeling that high. Remember the concept of addiction. I feel bad, so I have to do something to feel better. But then you get stuck. So, where am I going with this? I want to say a principle. We're all addicted to something. Sin, we've all got. Maybe the screen, maybe the media, maybe even, for some people it's gambling, for some people it's romance, whatever. We're all addicted to something. And I would say that we're either in recovery or we're backsliding, or you could say free falling. That's how it is in the Christian life. You could say, spiritually speaking, we're either walking on water or we're sinking with things such as sin and other addictions. We're either being healed from that, or we're falling deeper and deeper into it. It's just that simple. And so the question is, how can we get recovery? How can we get healing? How can we get the wholeness that our hearts yearn for? We'll come to this. It's the unconditional love of God, reflected through the love of others who express and give us unconditional love. But the idea that I think is so key is something that I actually had to hear from a priest once. He was my spiritual director, and thank God I'm not like making headlines, but we all have struggles. And he said this to me, I was probably 26. He said 3 words that probably I'm still fully digesting, but I really needed to hear. He said, isolates, those who are isolated or lonely, isolates never heal. Do we hear that? Those who are isolated never heal. That wound will be there. And if they're isolated from God, it's a crown of thorns, but without the grace. It's a doorway, not to the hellish experiences of dealing with our stuff that then lead to healing in heaven, but it's just a descent of falling headlong into more and more things that we're trying to use to feel better, or people we might use to feel better, and it's just terrible. It's just a gruesome life. The bombardments, as I said, of Ukraine are going on in the human heart right now. Unless God's grace is breaking through, unless that hurt can be a doorway to the unconditional love of God. And this is the power of what God can do, because sometimes it's in the darkest moments. Sometimes it's when there's no consolation and no seeming faith previously that someone might cry out to God. It's not just atheists in foxholes that are crying out. Sometimes it's atheists in good American lives. So this is, I want to tell you, we're almost done here. I want to tell you a story about a person, let's call him Jack. Jack was an atheist in his 20s, and he began to wonder, what am I going to do with my life? And who's going to help me? And so Jack kind of somehow, providentially, finds a mentor, and his mentor is Catholic. Jack is an atheist. And the mentor challenges in a charitable way Jack to say, I want you to make a wager. Your life is not going well. You want to be an artist. It's not working. You don't have the discipline. You don't have the guidance needed to make good art. So for 30 days, try this, this, and this. He gave him sort of a spiritual prescription of prayer on his knees in the morning, even though he's an atheist, just praying to God. And then doing some conversations with his mentor. Let's call his mentor David. So David and Jack are to talk regularly and cut out some unnecessary sin and come to Mass, let's say. It's interesting, where I found this, it says click here for the actual stuff, and the link is not found. So I'm just assuming, I know prayer on knees is part of it. But after 30 days of just mentoring and prayer, kind of God's mentoring him and all this, Jack becomes a Catholic. He was able to see a number of things. He was able to see how sin was at the cause of all the troubles in his life. And sin was a rejection of God's unconditional love in his life. When he would choose to do whatever sin does Jack, he was in that moment saying, God, get away. I'm putting that umbrella right up in your face so that your loving sun rays do not hit me right now. And the result of that action was always some form of unhappiness about something that happened in the past. Resentment at God for Jack maybe was resentment at his parents, maybe resentment at whoever picked on him in high school or middle school, resentment at whatever experiences that he felt isolated and abandoned from God, even though God was not the cause of that feeling. And so Jack is just sort of saying no to God because he had a bad experience in the past. So in that, he began to ask himself this question: what am I really unhappy about? Because it's not God. God was only trying to help little Jack. Jack in his 20s. We're all little kids deep down. And God is trying to help us and those who are orphans and widows. And what is with this rejection of God? Well, as I said before, it's conditioned love, it's other stuff. And I'll just quote this Jack here. It says, his experience has been that there's no form of unhappiness, regardless of the external events that might trigger it, that is not caused by a rejection of God's love. We have within us a certain self-centeredness that wants to shut out God, and that's called sin. And when he got his help from his mentor, David, he could finally write down, and part of his little therapy was writing down when he felt unhappy, what was he really feeling? And it wasn't what God was doing to him. It was something sort of, he had to go back to his own personal hell. What was it way back when that I'm feeling now that I don't realize because I never slow down enough to feel what I'm feeling? And maybe that is the path to healing. So whether it's envy or anger or lust, he said here that it all came down to bringing to God how he felt in that moment and saying, heal this, God. That's a really powerful prayer. We could take that at home and maybe say that to ourselves. Heal me, Lord. Heal me, Lord. When we're feeling stressed in traffic, when we're feeling hungry on a fast day, when we are feeling hungry for human love, connection with the godly people of this world, and we're not getting that, we can say, heal me, Lord. Because that is, as I said, the poke point in our heart, the doorway that God can really help us with. We're running out of time. I want to say a couple more things, otherwise the discussion later will be a little harder to do. I want to say this. Trauma can be very, very difficult. I don't watch the show, but I did see an article about it that really intrigued me. A very popular show right now is called Yellowjackets. It's about a soccer team that has a plane crash. There are survivors on this soccer team, a teen girl soccer team, but they have to become it's like the Lord of the Flies book, if you know that. They fend for themselves. They're all teenagers. Cannibalism ensues. Tribalism ensues among this soccer team. But then they get rescued. And then they get back to reality. And they go to college and they get jobs. And all this stuff, all of a sudden, it's a weird show. I've never seen it. I do not recommend it unless you have some type of vid angel, which is a way to censor your content because it's extremely graphic and very bad stuff goes on in the show. I've just read an article about it. But what happens 20 years later when these kids are running for public office and in their marriages and having, regular experiences, something is somehow triggering them. And they're back in their cannibalistic Lord of the Flies trauma. What's happening to them 20 years later is someone cutting them off in traffic. Or, in the one kind of interesting, the article said, the one person who is the leader is running for office, but some people who know who she really is are trying to show the dirt on her. And so there's this competition. And in those moments, there's actually murders that come when that person somehow through their trauma goes back because they're just triggered and they're somehow back on the airplane, the wilderness of their airplane crash experience. I would say that's an extreme example of what happens to all of us. That if we're not healed, if we are isolated and just kind of cope with screens or some other addiction, that somehow something is hitting us now that we're not dealing with that's making us overreact and maybe blow our heads off, so to speak, verbally with abuse or just yelling, whatever. We don't have to name it pejorative abuse. We just yell at people a lot. Or we could turn in on ourselves. Some people just don't interact because they're too hurt. They don't want to get triggered again and all this stuff. And we could go into all this stuff. I don't want to get too psychological. But I would say what breaks that cycle, what gets through someone who's closed up or who's just raging in their, you might say, triggers, I would say it's God's love. It seems so flippant. But God's love, which comes to us in many forms, in the sacrament of reconciliation, you may feel a touch of healing that will invite more healing. Please come. If it's been a while, it's been even a couple months, come back to the sacrament of reconciliation. Because that will touch your heart, which is wounded and traumatized, and it will give you God's unconditional love in the fullness of his grace and sanctifying grace. Then we can keep getting it at Holy Mass and receive Holy Communion. But I think I'm at the risk of, I don't want to undercut the sacramental graces of the church, but I want to even just look at this. Like sometimes it's romantic love. Sometimes there's someone who you've maybe married then sacramentally that kind of brought you out of it. I had people in my family tree that said, when I met your aunt, I was one way, and now I am different. She has helped me. You know, that's good. Maybe God used that. Maybe there's other people. Maybe there's godparents who could begin to be that presence in their godchild's life. And here's where it gets really dicey, because we feel guilt if we're the godparent or we're the adult, and we want to somehow change them, make them perfect, do it on our terms. But it's really just kind of stepping back, being present with them, making time. It's been told you spell the word love, Time. By being present with that person, by loving them, you're giving them the healing graces. You're reflecting the love of God. And it'll actually go further if you not try to control them in their life, if you just sort of welcome them and embrace them. And then your example, you do give kind words and you do give challenging words if you've earned that sort of rapport. Because sadly, we could have a spiritual relationship with someone as a godparent, but maybe we've made none of the human relation connections to really go there spiritually. That would take time to do. So there's this line from a movie I've never seen, but I think it's very, very poetic. The movie is called As Good as It Gets. As Good as It Gets, Jack Nicholson. And he sees this lady. They probably got their own hurts that lead them to meet each other. And in a very stupid scene where he's a total jerk, in a restaurant, he looks at her and says, "You make me want to be a better man." And that's all he had to say. Like, she falls in love with him instantly. She probably could do much better than him. But that desire to do better is what hooks her. It's what sparks him. His experience with this lady makes him want to do better. And I haven't seen the whole movie. So maybe he doesn't do good in the end. Or maybe he's not a worthy spouse. But both of them, both broken people, are worthy of God's love. And you are worthy of God's love. And you don't have to earn that. You don't have to prove that. But what you do have to do is begin to heal. And that the first step is just the time with the Lord, time to pray, time to say to God, heal me. Or just let him do it by that time. Maybe he'll come with all your hurts and you feel no resolution. But over time, you will see great, great results. I guarantee you that. And I would say that a key untapped potential in any human being's life is the fact that not only can God coach us, he can be our healer, and he is, but we can get a very substantial help and a healing from the unconditional love of somebody else. Somebody, a parent, a spouse, a mentor, who you name it. They can be that presence for us. And until we find that, we may be searching our whole lives and maybe going down the path of Amy Winehouse or others who just feel isolated and they turn to their addiction. And remember, isolates never heal. But what if we could experience something of God's presence, a healing presence? And what if, and here's, I don't want to get too Protestant, but what if I could ask you to look around the room right now? Please, could you gaze around at the faces in this room? What if these very faces could be the same people who are maybe not equipped to do so, who are maybe not experts, but who could be that caring and loving presence for Jesus in this parish? St. John the Evangelist Parish is not just a sacramental fill-up station that then you get in your car and you go home to your isolated experience. You could do that, but what if we could start to have less isolation? Long term in this parish, we want to we're really close to hiring someone, but we want to hire someone who could oversee a coordinated effort where people do not feel overwhelmed and they don't feel like they have to take over a group. They could be trained. So little pods are possible. We already have tons of great things like Men's Club and Renew groups. They're still meeting decades later. Some of you are in them. And so we're not going to take those away. But we want to add opportunities for people or empower existing groups to be agents of healing and welcoming groups, not closed off, sort of, this is our group, newcomers not welcome is sort of the attitude that sometimes people give or that people are getting when they try a new group. But this idea is our parish could be presences of Jesus Christ. People who are looking to God, looking to Jesus, reflecting his love, and willing to go there through the messiness. But it starts with those pierced points of our heart. Can we bring them to God? Can we let him heal us? And what if we could do that together? So I'm going to end the video here